Everybody, welcome to Retro Wrestling with Gene Jackson right here from the Retro Wrestling Archive on YouTube. We have another great episode in store for you today. I'm excited. I have a guest who is a fellow podcaster. I recently had the pleasure of doing his podcast. We had a great time. We talked some USWA wrestling, and I said, "Hey, man, let's." Let's return the favor. Let's get you on Retro Wrestling. And he let me choose the episode of USWA Wrestling from 1996 that we discussed on his show. So I said, hey, it's only fair. I'll let you pick your favorite wrestling show, or just not necessarily his favorite. That's not fair to say. I don't know that this is his favorite wrestling show, but he picked a great show for us to cover. I'm going to let him tell you a little bit about it. But right now, I want to welcome my guest. He is the host of Tyler's Takedowns, which is a fun wrestling podcast that I thoroughly enjoy. Like I said, I had a great time as a guest on his show. He's also got a music podcast that he hosts as well. So he is a man of many interests. He's not just a wrestling fan, folks. He likes other things as well, and there's nothing wrong with that. My mom tried to convince me of that for years when I was growing up. I finally accepted eventually that, Gene, the world doesn't revolve around wrestling, and it turned out I guess she was right. But anyway, it's enough of me rambling. Let's bring on my guest right now, my buddy, Tyler Peters. Tyler, how's it going, man?
Gene, it is a pleasure, and it's going well. Thank you so much for inviting me on your awesome program. I'm such a huge fan of all your work, and I'm just so humbled by the fact that you decided to come on to my show, Tyler's Takedowns, and thank you for plugging it at the beginning. I am just such a huge supporter. I love all of what you do as far as wrestling podcasting. So the pleasure is all mine, my friend.
Oh, well, that is very nice of you to say, but man, I did. I had a great time on your podcast. We got to talk about USWA wrestling for like 2 hours, which some people might have been like, "All right, man, enough of this Gene Jackson guy." But I appreciate you having me on and indulging me in a discussion of one of my all time favorite USWA wrestling episodes. And so when I invited you on, I said, "Hey, man, let's let you pick a show," and we're going to get to that in just a moment. But before we get there, just in case somebody listening to this show or watching this show on YouTube right now has been living under a rock and somehow they don't know who Tyler Peters is. I don't know how, but these things happen sometimes. Let's talk about it a little bit. When do you remember in your life becoming a wrestling fan? Like, where did it click with you where it was more than just a casual thing, where it was hey, man, I'm really into this, I need more of this in my life?
It began back with WCW, World Championship Wrestling. I would say the mid 90s, maybe 1993, 1994, was when I started becoming attracted to professional wrestling and also the WWF at the time, and was aware of a lot of the territories like Smoky Mountain Wrestling, which I know we'll discuss. But some of my favorites were Sting, Ric Flair, the Four Horsemen. A lot of those I know sounds pretty ordinary to discuss, but they were some of the ones that were very important to me. I gotta admit, I was a Hulk Hogan fan. I know he wasn't the greatest technical wrestler, but I got caught up in kind of the hero approach with the red and yellow colors, and there just was a lot. Shawn Michaels, Bret Hart come to mind, The Undertaker. So that's when wrestling became such a big part of my life, and I've never looked back. Regardless of taking breaks and taking time away from it, I always find myself back watching it. So I think it's just always been a part of my life, just like with you, Gene. I'm sure you can attest to that fact.
Oh, absolutely. And I find all of us, wrestling fans, longtime wrestling fans, smart wrestling fans, if you will, always feel like we kind of got to qualify or quantify the statement of, I was a Hulkamaniac, because it's not a popular thing to say in 2024 for various reasons, whether you're whether you're one of these guys that are, into the star ratings and you're a reader of the dirt sheets, or you're just not into the things Hulk Hogan's has said publicly in the last 15 years. But man, I started following wrestling religiously, I guess you could say, in late '85, early '86. I was there, for the original Hulkamania run. You called it in the '90s when it was kind of having a rebirth in WCW right before Hollywood came along. And maybe younger people who didn't get to experience in real time the era of Hulkamania, be it the '80s or the '90s, they can't really wrap their head around and appreciate it. And it's all about the work rate and all that nonsense. But man, Hulk Hogan, as a kid growing up, you couldn't help be a Hulkamaniac, man. I mean, it was, he had the marketing machine behind him. They were feeding him all these monsters, then he was taking them down one by one. And I'm sorry, a lot of people will argue with me on this. To this day, WrestleMania 3 is my favorite WrestleMania of all time, just for sentimental value. I was 10 years old when I watched it happen. I really thought that Andre the Giant was going to be the one to take down my beloved Hulkster, and he pulled it out. Even though according to him, he didn't even know if he was going to pull. Not only did I not know if Hulk Hogan was going to win, but poor Hulk Hogan didn't know he was going to win. So, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, man. I think some of us need to start owning it a little bit more, but I get it.
Well, I appreciate that. And so I have to admit it, just like Eugene, I was infatuated with Hulk Hogan. Whether you like the man or not, I know he's controversial, but so are a lot of wrestlers. Let's be honest. And I was just caught up even in the mid 90s with the red and yellow. Of course, you mentioned it with Hollywood Hogan. It was during that change with the NWO. And I've grown to appreciate a lot of the regional wrestling that your podcasts go into such great, deep conversations about. And yeah, I have to admit, I was a Hulkamaniac, and I like Bret Hart too. Just
Oh
like
yeah,
there's a lot of Goldberg fans, but yet he does not like Goldberg. So it's a lot of fun. I kind of laugh about it because I'm like, at the end of the day, just entertain me. I'm not going to get in between any personal issues. I don't really know all these guys that well, so I'm just here for the ride. Just make me suspend my disbelief, and you got me.
absolutely. And people who are sports fans who aren't wrestling fans, sometimes get disappointed when they get older. And I don't want to take this podcast down a whole different rabbit hole, but it's like just because you enjoy them and their chosen form of sports or entertainment, or in this case, sports entertainment, just because you're a fan of what Hulk Hogan did in the ring in the '80s and '90s doesn't mean you sign off on everything Terry Bollea did outside of it, then or now. And as like I say, there's some of the most popular sports stars that people absolutely loved. O.J. Simpson, that people later found out they weren't the greatest people in the world. It's just it's to me, there's two different sides to people, and we can separate them. Maybe not Chris Benoit. I don't know. I don't make that argument with anybody. I get it. If you can't separate those two things, yeah, I get that. That's understandable. But
Yeah, I,
you
I understand. Yeah.
know,
No, there's always different perspectives to your point. Yeah, Chris Benoit, that's for a whole nother program.
oh yeah,
But that's a little more toward. Well, I'm just going to stay off of it
yeah.
before I
We'll
get in trouble.
we'll
So,
save that discussion for another day. So how do we make the leap from longtime wrestling fan to moving into the world of pro wrestling podcasting? What podcast grabbed you? Which one made you think, hey man, this is something I would like to do?
it's interesting you asked me that, Gene. I started as a co-host. I did not become just a solo podcast or get to interviewing people like yourself who are, to me, know the history of wrestling or independent wrestlers. I had to do a lot of studies under these talented people regarding several podcasts, and I got to thinking, why not try it? And that's the gist of it. I know it's probably not the most thrilling answer. I just envision myself, let me try to develop my voice and see how it goes. And it's always practice. It's never going to be perfect. So I continue to grow in that regard. And it's really where I got inspired to do this. I just thought, I'm just a wrestling fan. Let me put some research into it. Let me take from what I was able to obtain from these different podcasts and use them as some positive influences because I would not be where I am without them. And there you go. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. I just kind of took little bits and pieces here and there. I think that's with any of us to start this podcasting journey.
Yeah, I agree. Like for me, um, and even more so now than ever, I find it gives my fandom a purpose. Like I've spent dedicated most of my life to just studying wrestling, watching every bit that I can, reading every book I can get my hands on, watching every interview, and just learning as much about it as I can. And so I feel like all this time I've invested in it, it gives it a purpose to be able to share that with people in some form or another. Um, and it makes it feel like, hey, this wasn't all for nothing. I had a reason for doing this, and so I totally get what you're saying. I mean, you said you thought it was a boring answer, but no, it's. I respect that because I'm not going to knock anybody, and not name any names, but like there's certain podcasts that I'll give them a shot, or somebody will send me a link and go, hey, listen to this and let me know what you think. And I listen to them and I'm like, what are we doing here? Like, what's your purpose? Like, what drove you to do this? Because, like, sometimes people they aren't, and I'm not faulting them. Just like they're not particularly knowledgeable on the subject. They'll interview people that they seemingly really don't know anything about. They know this person is a name. They know that they did something in wrestling, and so they'll ask them some very generic questions, and you listen to a whole interview, and you're like, I don't know anything more about this person now than I did before it started. And I always question, like, what drives them to do this? Like, what makes them want to do this other than just to be like, yeah, I'm going to try it, or I'm going to do a wrestling podcast because it's a cool thing to do. And I say, I can say I'm a podcaster now, but I love the fact
Right.
that listening to your shows and talking to you the times I have, it's obvious that you've watched wrestling and you're constantly learning. You're constantly just by the questions you ask in interviews that you're learning in the process of doing these interviews. They aren't just like, hey, I'm gonna ask some cool questions so this guy can, talk on my show. Like you can tell you're mining for information as you're doing interviews, which I got a lot of respect for that.
Well, thank you, and I've got a lot of respect for Eugene, and that's the whole point. I mean, why have people on your program if you don't want to do any kind of preparation, get to know how they got into wrestling, some career highlights, and try to come about it where you're coming off as professional. I know these are for fun, but I always want to take it with the merit that hey, they're taking time to come onto my show, whether it's a wrestler, it's a fellow podcaster. I don't care if it's on the music show, the wrestling one. Much like yourself, I want to make sure that I've got some facts going or some kind of reference. That way, I'm not like a deer in the headlights. Because to me, that's disrespectful. It's just my perspective on it. Maybe I'm off base and I don't try to take myself too seriously, but I actually want to try to do my part in at least faking being a journalist. I've never tried to claim I was one, but at least to like what you're mentioning, you want to get the info ready and together so you're not just sitting there, whether it's a video like this or audio, and you've got a frame of reference because that is one of my pet peeves. I mean, it always has been when doing podcasts. That's just so, and I don't mean to make it less fun here, but if you're inspiring to do a podcast, that's pretty common sense to me.
Yeah. I don't expect you to know everything about a person before you interview them because that's part of the purpose of interviewing somebody is to learn about them and
Sure.
to find more information. But you got to know enough about somebody to know what questions to ask and even to know what road to travel down to get where you want to go. And I always try to look at it, I always try to put myself in the listener's shoes and go, if I'm sitting down and listening to this show, what am I getting from this? What am I learning, or in what way is this entertaining? Why did I just spend an hour or more listening to what I just listened to? And if I can't, if when I go to make the descriptions for these things, if I can't come up with a paragraph of stuff from the interview or the show that's interesting enough to describe it, then I'm asking myself, why is anybody going to listen to this? What are they going to gain from it? I can't come up with enough stuff to even sell them on it to give them a reason to listen. So, and again, I'm not doing
No,
this
it's a good way to look at it.
to knock anybody or bury anybody. It's really just kind of a thing of like, hey, if you do a podcast of any kind, not just wrestling, just podcasts in general, ask yourself, what am I doing here? What am I offering a listener? And I'm not saying, oh, well, quit, but ask yourself those questions. And if you don't have answers to them, figure out an answer to them, and get better. I mean, that's what I strive to do all the time. I've been doing this since 2007, but I'm always trying to find ways to get better and make the show more interesting um, and entertaining at the same time. I don't want it to, I don't have a boring wrestling podcast, but I want it to be fun, and I also want people to walk away learning something they didn't know before they came on. So I like that we're on the
Yeah,
same
you
page
never
in that respect.
Yeah, I'm on the same page with you, Gene. You never want to be satisfied. Uh, Regardless of improvement, there's always going to be something, and that's something. Speaking of that, which I'm understanding with this whole podcasting venture. So I appreciate the kind words, and hey, I appreciate the criticisms because listen, that's how we all get better. So if you want to do this, then I mean, it's going to entail having to do some work, and that's with anything. If you want to be at least decent, and if you want to be really good, you're going to have to separate yourself from the others. And I'm saying that respectfully. I'm not
Oh
trying
yeah.
to put myself on a pedestal. I can understand Gene because, like you said, you've got the experience, and that's why I love getting to talk with you because it's always like an encyclopedia of territorial wrestling, and I want to be like a sponge. It's amazing, and I'm like your student. He's the teacher. There you go.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, I asked you, I said, hey, man, what show would you like to talk about? And I was afraid because I've pitched this to people before, and a lot of times people come back and go, oh, whatever you want to. And we'll bat that back and forth a few times. And so I asked, and almost immediately you were like, Smoky Mountain Wrestling Bluegrass Brawl 1993. And I was like, my face lit up. I'm like, yes, number one, he has an opinion. Number two, he picked something that I can definitely, I've seen it, but it's been a long time. So it's something I wanted to watch again. So excellent choice. So as we lead into
Oh, thank
this,
you.
based on when you started watching wrestling, and you started with WCW and WWF like most anybody would. Tell me about when you first remember becoming aware of Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and what your early impressions were, and how you managed to become familiar with it.
It was around the same time as my exposure to the two big organizations you just mentioned, Gene, with WCW and the WWE. Smoky Mountain Wrestling became famous around East Tennessee, the Tri Cities, and all throughout the Southeast. Eventually, it gained national exposure, at least from a territorial point of view. And Jim Cornette, I was such a huge fan of Jim Cornette that I wanted to see what he was going to do. I remember him getting fired from Jim Herter. Maybe he sent in his notice. I'm trying to recall, and he wanted to go back to how things were back in the day, and I appreciate his approach. He's so creative, and he was able to kind of recreate studio wrestling and also the live event business to where it was in college gyms like we would see here in Pikeville, Kentucky, and you just begin to realize there were so many stars that you would see in WCW and WWE, and sometimes before in ECW that would appear and go through Smoky Mountain Wrestling. So, from that standpoint, I was already interested. I just had became aware of this organization, not just because of Cornette, but because of all the great talent and legends, as we'll see for the Bluegrass Brawl. Pardon me, and it was just an extraordinary event. It's something I had never witnessed. I mean, I had seen some of the Smoky Mountain programs, but I got to be honest, I've not had an opportunity to watch this event. To me, Gene, it was an equivalent of like their pay per view when they would have these live house shows. They would go back and
Right.
show them and have a lot of their big feuds and angles built around it with all these kind of unique matches. And I know we'll discuss it. So yeah, Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and I've grown to appreciate it just like everything else by going back and reviewing it. So I just happen to think, why not? Let's talk some Smoky Mountain Wrestling because I know you have a podcast with Doug Gilbert. You know a lot about Memphis and so much of it in Smoky Mountain as well. There was a lot of USWA and Memphis personnel that came through thanks to Cornette and those relationships. So I thought it immediately, why not Smoky Mountain Wrestling?
Absolutely. It was a good call because I remember becoming aware of Smoky Mountain and in the era that it came about in like, 91, 92 through the magazines. I was a big collector of the after mags. Well, any wrestling magazine, honestly, that I could get my hands on. And having, being such a huge fan of Memphis, growing up a fan of Continental, I realized that Cornette's involved. I hear Dirty White Boy, Stud Stable, Tracy Smothers, Bullet Bob Armstrong, and I'm like, oh my god, Jim Cornette is recreating like a mishmash of Continental and Memphis in the Smoky Mountains. And unfortunately, in North Mississippi, we couldn't. I mean, there was no way to get it on TV over here. There's absolutely wasn't. Now, eventually, shows like the Bluegrass Brawl were recorded for VHS releases, and you would sometimes find them available in the magazines. And so, after following in the magazines, reading results, reading what was going on, I managed to order some of these video cassettes. And so that was my initial exposure to actually seeing Smoky Mountain and not just reading about it. And man, I wore these tapes out as I got them. And I didn't get all of them, but I got a handful. But it was years later when I got into tape trading, uh, when I was able to start getting like whole season or whole years of, I guess they're not really seasons, but like 1992 Smoky Mountain, it's every TV episode, and then start getting all these events. And oh man, that was just absolutely awesome. Uh, but this one is special to me in general because anybody who listened to our podcast we did together for Tyler's Takedowns, as we talked about the USWA, of course, we talked about our shared admiration and respect for Lance Russell. And here we've got a Smoky Mountain Wrestling event with Lance Russell and Les Thatcher making the call. Now, how cool is that?
I thought it was tremendous because if you look at Les Thatcher, he was essential to Ron Fuller's promotion, Southeastern being the lead announcer. He was also a great wrestler with, I believe, the Crockett's and a lot of promotions. I think he started out, Gene, in Boston for Tony Santos. And I loved Lance Russell, the pairing with Les Thatcher. And I don't think Les Thatcher gets the love that he should as a
He
wrestling
doesn't.
commentator. And anything Lance Russell does is going to be fantastic. And I thought Lance Russell was bringing back some passion during these type of matches, and you could tell that the people in Pikeville knew who Lance Russell. I mean, it because they
Oh
would
yeah.
go to Louisville. I mean, it was not uncommon for Kentucky to know Lance. So I'm with you. We have a shared admiration for Lance and major respect for Les Thatcher too.
Absolutely. Because, yeah, again, big fan of Continental. Southeastern was before my time. So, again, it was one of those things where I studied on it. I've watched old tapes in my tape trading days up through now and became familiar with him more after the fact than in the actual time frame. But as we go along, I've got us a few little graphics here we can put up. So there's the old Smoky Mountain logo, and there's the Bluegrass Brawl, April 2nd, 1993, Pikeville, Kentucky, as you mentioned. And we've got what they report to be around 2,000 fans in this gym, Tyler. And they
That's
were
incredible.
fired up. for most of what they saw here. And there we see Lance and Les in the ring. I liked how, they weren't standing in front of a green screen. They weren't standing back from that wood paneling in the back where Brian Matthews would be doing the interviews. And there's a little look at that.
Sure.
Well, since we mentioned it,
There's Brian Matthews. He did a great job. I didn't know, Gene, that he had wrestled. I had to go back and research Brian Matthews a little bit, and he did a great job. But yeah, I never understood the wood paneling. That did look a little bit cheap, but maybe that was kind of the gritty effect before we knew an Attitude Era. Not that this was trying to mimic that, because this was well before all the Monday Night Wars, but it may have had the feel of the old territorial approach where, hey, we just don't have anything, so we're just going to stand in front of a wood wall. I don't know, but I
yeah, I
caught it as
mean,
well.
my wife was in the room when I was watching this the other night, and he popped up on the screen, and she's like, "It's wood paneling like your parents' house used to have." It's like, where are they at? I was like, well, they didn't always hang up banners in the late '80s and early '90s like they do, in later years. So, yeah, we're just rocking the wood paneling back there and getting these interviews done. But like I said, Brian Matthews did a great job, and he got quite a few interviews throughout the night. But again, I
No, he
like
did.
that Lance and Les Thatcher are right there center ring to kick things off. They get the crowd fired up. Lance kind of runs through the card of what they can expect. And like you mentioned before, we've got the culmination of some big feuds happening on this show. There's a lot of backstory to a lot of this stuff going on here.
No, we did. We've got this event branded as one of the grander ones because it is the Bluegrass Brawl, and you're in Kentucky. They played my old Kentucky home. It's like their national anthem, but it's a state anthem. And I found it interesting. Les Thatcher's told the PA person, "Hey, play my old Kentucky home." It was a nice way to probably please the people there in Pikeville, and I love the tandem. I didn't think Thatcher or Russell had worked together before, so I was pleasantly surprised. I thought they did a great job. It was had that classic wrestling feel, and you brought up a great point, Gene. It did have some of the Ron Fuller, Jerry Jarrett culmination. The kind of, if you were to pollinate those two brands, I love how you worded that. That was so apropos for this type of event.
And obviously, that would be because Jim Cornette is a guy who had, come into the business under Jerry Jarrett. And I don't know at this point if he had worked much for Ron Fuller, but he certainly was familiar with Southeastern and Les Thatcher. And I'm sure, you know, Jim's one of the original tape traders back in the day, him and Kenny Bolin. So I'm sure he had traded for tapes and watched a lot of Southeastern wrestling. Plus, them being up in Louisville, up in Knoxville rather. I'm sure he probably made it to some shows down there when Southeastern was up there before they moved down into Alabama for a while. So yeah, that's why we get that flavor, because Cornette was heavily influenced by both of those guys and both of those promotions. So it's pretty cool to see now he's getting to put this stuff to work. And he's talked about in podcast uh, in recent years how much promotion went into this particular show, that they put the tickets on sale a month in advance, which was kind of rare for these types of events back there. They were selling tickets at the local bank so that people were going in cashing their check, and they would go, "Hey, you want to buy wrestling tickets to this fundraiser event we got coming up in Pikeville?" And hey, you got your full paycheck in your hand. Yeah, give us some tickets. And he said that they had gotten like Domino's Pizza as a sponsor, so they had this golden circle tickets for the front row where they were $15 a piece back in 1993. You got front row tickets, and you got some Domino's Pizza, and I think you got to meet some of the the babyface wrestlers. And this was a financially beneficial show, as he explained it. And like we said, 2,000 people there in '93 is nothing to sneeze at, to say the least.
No, not at all. It's an astounding figure to get that many people in this gymnasium. I know it could fit a lot, but it was packed, to your point. And I appreciate you coming up with the stats, and giving us the number. That's why, man, I so appreciate being on this program, Gene. This guy knows his stuff, and you can tell he's been successful. And Jim Cornette, I mean, you said it. He appreciates wrestling. He's a historian. That's why I love when he does the deep dives, like on the Tennessee territory. Makes you understand where he's coming from. Ron Fuller, I would say, Gene, it's probably pretty common for the Fullers to have passed through Memphis because
Oh yeah.
I think at one time didn't the Fullers help book for Jerry Jarrett before Lawler and that
Yeah,
the previous era?
Robert came in and booked. They would bring Ron in from Knoxville to work some main events. He was Southern Heavyweight Champion and worked for him. I don't know that Ron did a lot of booking. I think Robert was more the booker most of the
Okay,
time. But Ron definitely came in, and I'm sure he had some influence. And of course, Buddy Fuller was involved in Memphis, the Memphis territory at different times. So yeah, the Fullers, while in retrospect, are more known for the Southeastern Territory and all that. The Fullers, they were a big part of Memphis over the years as well. So that's a good point.
We'll return after these messages.
Hey guys, Ray Russell here, curator of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, inviting you guys to listen to many of the programs here as part of the WrestleCopia brand, including, but not limited to, the Wrestling Memory Grenade, currently covering the 1988 and the WWF project. You can also listen to the Regional Wrestling Podcast, where we talk the territories, whether it's Jamie Ward with Georgia 81, Roman Gomez with the UWF in 1986, or Gene Jackson covering Memphis in 85. 3 projects going on right now over there at Regional Wrestling. You can also listen to the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop. Bob goes back in time each and every week, covering not just his career, but countless stories and interactions with hundreds of wrestling names spanning his 2 decades in the business. But that's not all. You can also check out the Puro Wrestling Academy with the professor of Puro Resu, Mr. Dan Ginnity. Dan and I go back in time and cover the history of Japanese professional wrestling in the English language. And you can listen to all of those shows and more, all part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, located over at WrestleCopia.com. That's WrestleCopia.com, and anywhere your podcast streaming needs are met, from Apple to Spotify, Pocket Cast, and beyond. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to our social media guys for all the latest goings on here at the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. Plus, I'm constantly adding old school video clips and pictures from throughout wrestling history. You can follow us over on X, formerly Twitter, at Wrestling Grenade. That's at RASSLIN Grenade. Also, follow and like me, Facebook.com/Wrestling Grenade. And why not subscribe to YouTube.com/Wrestling Grenade. So if you're looking to support that next up and coming podcast brand, please consider making it WrestleCopia.
So I'm gonna let you kind of run down the card. I am going to mention this match because I don't know if you have it noted because it didn't appear on the video. And folks, if you want to see what we're talking about here, you can go on YouTube, type in SMW Bluegrass Brawl 93. There's 3-4 versions of it on there actually. I think I have it on my channel at this point. I can't swear to that, but there's 2 or 3 really good, clear versions of it on YouTube. Check any of them out, but you can watch this show in full that we're describing right here. Now, before the camera started rolling, or at least it didn't get included on this VHS release, there was a singles match where Robbie Eagle defeated Hustler Rip Rogers. Now, Robbie Eagle, if you're like, who's Robbie Eagle? I don't know who that is. Well, if you watched USWA, you might know Robbie Eagle as Gorgeous George III. And if you watched WCW in the waning days of in the later days of WCW, you might remember the Maestro and later the Stro. Started out as Robbie Eagle in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. I know we didn't get to see this match, but any thoughts on Robbie Eagle or Rip Rogers or those 2 guys in general?
Well, Robbie Eagle, I must admit, I saw him as the Maestro later on in WCW. That would be my first recollection of him as a wrestler. And it's a shame because, like you said, he was in USWA first. And Rip Rogers is great. I've got nothing but respect for the hustler, Rip Rogers. And it's a shame I didn't get to see this match. I had sent Gene the link, a version I was able to find, but it's so fascinating when you start researching these things that there's what 2 or 3 versions of it with matches kind of
Yeah.
edited out like you would on a lot of programs, which I understand, but it's a shame. I've got to go back and try to revisit that match now. So thank you for finding it and let me know about it. So that's my brief highlights. I wish I could elaborate more on
I
both Rick
found it in
Rogers and
results. I've never actually found the match. I don't know that the match exists
okay.
anywhere, but just going through the results just to make sure of a few of the stats, I came across that. And if you're watching this video on YouTube, or even if you're listening on Spotify, Apple, in the description, I will have the link to the version that Tyler sent me, because it's a very, like I say, it's a clear, good VHS rip of this show. So I'd recommend checking that one out. So when we get to the actual show, and like I said, we've already had Lance and Les Thatcher come out there and kind of give us a rundown of what to expect. Tell us how the actual show itself, as far as the video is concerned, what did that start out with, Tyler?
Well, it actually started out, if we're going by matches, I'm going to
Yes.
start with Rob Morgan versus the Mongolian Stomper. Now, it's a shame I don't know a whole lot about the Mongolian Stomper. Definitely have heard of him. From what I was able to obtain as far as information, Gene, you can help back me up here, is that he started with Stampede Wrestling, or maybe had a notorious run there. I don't know that he began with Stampede Wrestling. But as far as Southeastern and Knoxville, like you were saying with Cornette, at least respecting the legends and what people in the area, whether it was Kentucky, Tennessee, or the Carolinas, who they would be familiar with, would be like the people like the Mongolian Stomper. And he was unique. Something that I found very compelling, Gene, is he came out to John Carpenter's Halloween theme, which I found a little comical, yet it
Yeah.
worked because he's a scary big dude, is the Mongolian Stomper. And Rob Morgan's just as big, if not bigger. And I like how he started out aggressively. It was a nice, fast start. And the match did not last long. It was one of these quick matches. And we see the Mongolian Stomper and Rob Morgan fight on the outside. Then it's some kicks or big boots, in other words, and then he
Yeah.
submits Rob Morgan. That's all there is to it. I mean, please, if there's anything else, that's the opening match. There may have been a segment I missed. I've got some things written down, but I'll be honest, my memory fades at times, so I'll kind of make fun of myself at that.
No, I think we may have pitched to Brian Matthews, and it was just, hey, I'm Brian Matthews, and I'll be, getting some interviews backstage. But the little picture we showed a minute ago. And then we go into this opening match. Mongolian Stomper, absolute legend in this part of the world. Like you said, he was huge in Knoxville. He was huge in Memphis. And like I said, always billed as the Mongolian Stomper. So he didn't talk. He was like, for you somewhat younger fans, Sabu. He always had a manager, and he was this brooding, quiet monster. And then he went up to Stampede and became Archie the Stomper Goldie. And he did promos, and he wasn't Mongolian during that stretch. But that was in the territory days. People down here in Tennessee and Mississippi and Alabama, we didn't know what he was doing up in Canada. I mean, even if you saw
Correct.
magazines, a lot of them didn't cover Canada at that point in the 70s. So yeah, I'm sure this was exciting for the fans in Kentucky to see a legend like the Mongolian Stomper open the show. Now, a little bit of insight I've learned from listening to Cornette over the years. Rob Morgan drove Rip Rogers to the show. That's how he got the spot to wrestle the Mongolian Stomper. He was, quote unquote, Rip Rogers' driver. They needed an opponent for Mongolian Stomper to beat in a minute and a half, and he won the prize. Now, Cornette didn't confirm this, but I have my suspicions that the reason Rob Morgan attacked the Stomper as he was coming through the ropes was simply as an excuse for the Stomper not to take off his sweat jacket. He wrestled this match, his minute and a half match, in a sweat jacket, because at this point, Mongolian Stomper is quite up in age, still in pretty decent shape, mind you, but they probably wanted to keep that jacket on him at the time, and I think that's probably why Rob Morgan attacked him and why it never came off. That's purely speculation on my part. That may be completely wrong, but it's a
No,
pretty solid theory.
that's possible. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, Gene, because I did notice that, but I didn't know the whole backstory of why Mongolian Stomper didn't wrestle with his jacket on, and it was a nice, I guess, quick start just to get the fans going, and like you said, just because somebody else has a different persona somewhere else, if we don't see it on our TVs or aware of it or read it in magazines, they can come in like brand new or as a gimmick they've always been known for, depending on the certain territories. So, great points.
But yeah, Cornette did mention, I know in interviews over the years that he's bringing the Stomper in, and by this time music was prominent, and he thought, man, Mongolian Stomper, what are we going to use for music? And he goes, and I gave him the Halloween music from John Carpenter because I thought it was cool, and I thought, well, I did too. That was pretty fun to see,
Yeah, me
this
too.
guy come tearing out there to that song. So well done, Corny.
Yeah, Cornette did a nice job there because I wasn't expecting the Halloween theme, but I'm like you. I thought it fit him. He's supposed to be this big dude that comes in and takes care of business, and why not just give him the Halloween theme? So all is right in the world as far as not only Gene is concerned, but me. I'm in agreement with you. I thought it was a nice touch.
So then we hear from Brian Matthews and primetime Brian Lee. Now, how much? What was your knowledge of Brian Lee going into this?
There was not a lot of knowledge of Brian Lee. More of my knowing of Brian Lee was later in the WWE. I definitely became aware of him in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. I know he was an important fixture of the promotion. Primetime Brian Lee, I think I love this presentation better with the long blonde hair. And there was something unique about him. And we know he's going to address Kevin Sullivan. And I was never big on the whole fake Undertaker thing or the gang thing. Ordeal was okay with the Harris brothers. That was fine, but I prefer this Brian Lee right here. And I know he goes to ECW for a while too, but this is, uh, to be honest, my first real exposure as far as his early career. Uh, Let me just get to that concerning Brian Lee. But I love this kind of presentation. A lot of the wrestlers were having the long blonde hair, and it was indicative of the 80s, but it was kind of left over from the 90s, but it worked during this time. So, and the women loved him, this big, tall guy and athletic. And he was having some issues with the Taskmaster, Kevin Sullivan, as we'll find out later. But I liked him, man. I think this is the best representation of Brian Lee, personally.
So, me being the old guy, I remember Brian Lee coming into Memphis in 1988, along with the Harris brothers, which I think they're his cousins, I've been told. And strangely enough, and this may be hard for some of you to believe, but when they came into Memphis, Brian Lee and the two Harris brothers, who at this point, no tattoos, they had big blonde mullets or brownish blonde mullets like Brian has here, except they had mustaches. But they could, if they shaved the mustaches off and their hair was the same amount of blonde as Brian's, they almost could have been the Harris triplets. I mean, they all dressed similar. They teamed up a lot in Memphis. And then, of course, Harris brothers kept going off in another realm. And of course, then eventually they all kind of looked the same by the time they were bikers in WWF in the 90s. But Brian was a good baby face in Memphis, but he was just starting out. By this point in 93, he had really come into his own. And Cornette has said over the years that his initial intention in starting Smoky Mountain, Brad Armstrong was going to be his number one babyface. That was who he was going to push out of the gate as a champion. He was going to be the main event babyface star. But when it come time to do it, Brad was tied up in a contract. He couldn't come in. And so Cornette saw Brian Lee, big, good looking guy, pretty good wrestler. Think the ladies are going to like him. Let's run with him. And that's what he did. As Brian Lee was going along as the main event babyface, there started being these mystery promos. There was posters being put up in the arenas throughout the house shows and the TVs that somebody was coming for Brian Lee, that they had it in for Brian Lee. And this was a tease of several weeks, if not a few months, actually. And people had put a bounty on Brian Lee. And so these guys were coming in trying to collect this bounty. And so all these different people with heels were coming in trying to take out Brian Lee. And at the end of this angle, we find out it's the master, Kevin Sullivan. And then that led into this angle, which was Sullivan and Brian Lee. And so this match that we're going to be seeing coming up later in the show is a, I forget, what did they call it? I mean, I know what the match ended up being, but the gimmick was Brian was going to roll Russian roulette. There you go. So he's going to roll some dice. And depending on what number the dice lands on will depend on which match it's going to be. And poor Lance out there trying to have to explain this to the live audience. So we see Brian here with Brian Matthews, Brian Lee, Brian Matthews, too many Brians. And there we
a lot of Brians.
See him in the ring shooting dice here. Do you remember what our
I can't help it.
Yeah. I know, right? I had to get a screenshot of that because I was like, if you just showed this with no context at all, we're like, what is happening right here? The referee's in the corner, kind of bent down, looking somewhat almost embarrassed, and Brian's looking like he's having a dice game out behind the fast food restaurant somewhere on their break or something. But do you remember what some of the match options were for this?
I'm trying to recall all the match options. I know what it ended up being. To be fair, I had watched it last night. I don't recall all the stipulations. I know we eventually got to the Singapore Spike match. It just went by so fast. They were so long that you'll have to pardon. So I try to do my research, Gene, but I probably had an epic fail there, so forgive me.
No, you're good. I'm not trying. I wasn't trying to put you on the spot, but I didn't take the time to write them all down. I was just curious if you remember.
I didn't either. That's what I was going to say. No, I was going to say it all became a blur once. And like you said, poor Lance Russell having to roll the dice and explain that. It was almost like something you'd see out of wrestling in Memphis and a lot of the territories. You had a little bit. Who would ever thought Brian Lee would be rolling dice in a wrestling ring, and any wrestler for that matter? But I wanted to go back just real quickly about the Harris twins. To picture them with long blonde hair, that to me has got me just very intrigued, because I don't know that I could picture Ron and Don Harris without being bald. I'm just so used to that look. And for them and Brian Lee, didn't know they were related, but it makes sense. All big guys, and
yeah,
also
if you'll
Brad
go
Armstrong.
to YouTube, put in Bruise Brothers Memphis 1988, you'll see some matches of them during this time frame, and it's a very different presentation than the Harris brothers you would come to know years later.
That's what I'm thinking. And just real quick, Brad Armstrong, one of the all-time greats, and that's very fascinating that Cornette was going to build Smoky Mountain around him. So thanks for bringing him up. I love Brad Armstrong.
So he couldn't get Brad, but he got Bullet Bob in as the commissioner. He eventually got Scott, Steve, and then eventually got Brad way, way down the line. But yeah, that would have been a good get, but this definitely was a great opportunity for Brian Lee that no one had really, put him in a main event spot and really gave him that push. So this really helped his career. So, the loss of Brad Armstrong was definitely a gain for Brian Lee here.
Yeah, and I'm happy for Brian Lee. Like I said, I much rather see this primetime Brian Lee gimmick over his biker gimmick later. I mean, he pulled it off with his relatives, the Harris twins. But this is my preference, primetime Brian Lee. I'll just keep going back to it.
Yeah, I like it. So we roll the dice. All 6 numbers on the dice represented a different match with. So let me back up and say one thing here. So the month prior to this, there had been a Singapore Spike match in Knoxville, and Sullivan won. He got the Spike. So what a Singapore Spike match is, I'm sure not everybody. I didn't know what the heck a Singapore Spike match was previous to Smoky Mountain. They put wooden boxes on each corner, and in one of those wooden boxes, Kevin Sullivan's famous golden Singapore Spike is in one of those boxes. And if you can get it and find it, you can use it legally, and in theory, that's going to end the match. So in Knoxville, they had one of these matches per the request of Kevin Sullivan. Sullivan ends up winning the match against Brian Lee. So that's why we're having this rematch. And so this time, to kind of tip the scales in Brian's favor, the powers that be, not Jim Cornette, because he's just a manager at this point, as far as we know, have made this the Russian roulette match where Brian's going to roll these dice. Each number represented a different match. And they were just all gimmick matches, even if me and Tyler don't remember what they are. It's your typical, Texas Death and, this, that, and the other.
Absolutely.
But one of the options, I think like number 4, I believe it was the Singapore Spike match. And number 6 was Brian's choice. He could pick any match of the 5 options. Well, Brian rolls number 6, and he chooses to have a rematch of the Singapore Spike match that he lost to Kevin Sullivan in Knoxville. What a bold babyface thing to do, to try it again. So we'll see how that turns out for him later in the card.
No, we do. And I love how, Gene, it connected the story. I love the background you provide. It's just so vital to every event, but especially the one we're discussing here. And Kevin Sullivan, for me, and I'm sure you probably feel the same way. I'll just speak for me. Was so ahead of his time, whether you liked all of his wacky ideas or not. You always knew you were in for something that was going to be bizarre, just like Thatcher would mention on commentary. Kevin Sullivan, could reinvent himself. He was just such a creative master. I mean, he was what he exemplified. He was a master manipulator, and that's what wrestling does to fans. It manipulates us. We suspend our disbelief, and Kevin Sullivan was just so talented. I mean, he truly was. I'm just gosh, I miss a lot of these wrestlers. I'm thankful we've got the memories by watching these type of shows, because it just makes you have such a fondness for all these great legends.
I really hope people take advantage of YouTube and things of that nature to go back and learn. If depending on your age and when you came into wrestling, if you only know Kevin Sullivan from the Dungeon of Doom and WCW, or you only know him, say you were in it in the 80s and you saw the Varsity Club and then you checked out forever. Maybe you didn't see Kevin in Smoky Mountain in the master role where he's feuding with Brian Lee. Maybe you didn't see Kevin down in Florida where he was, quote unquote, the devil, his most famous run ever, most creative run ever, where people were scared to death of the man and they really literally thought he was the devil, even though he never said the word devil. He never said the word Satan. He never came out and professed to be any of those things, but people read between the lines, and they're out there setting fire to his car in the parking lot and wanting to run him out of town. So I think it's great. In my day when I was growing up, I had to trade tapes with strangers and hope they sent me what they said they were going to. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. And sometimes the quality was good, and sometimes it was garbage. To see all this stuff that I had only read about in magazines. And now, Tyler, if I get a wild hair, if I'm sitting here and me and you were talking, you're like, man, did you ever see when Kevin Sullivan was in Smoky Mountain and he had the Singapore Spike match with, Brian Lee, who was a babyface at the time? I could be like, oh, I've never seen that. And you're like, well, go on YouTube and I can go see it just like that. I don't have to put nothing in the mail. I don't have to roll the dice and hope no pun intended with this match, but and hope that I get anything. So people are really spoiled today, not just with like the network, but just free YouTube that anybody can access at just about any and every territory you can think of, from the South up into Portland and Hawaii and Japan and all this great stuff. So it's what a time to be alive.
Just everywhere. No, I agree with you. And Gene, I was going to ask you, do you remember Blockbuster? A lot of times to rewatch like some old NWA events or WrestleManias, that's how I would do it. I would see them at Blockbuster when that was a big deal. So we're very fortunate with the libraries that we have, whether it's YouTube or the network, like you were mentioning, and it's just it's always fun to go back and watch these matches, and they were brutal. I mean, this was very indicative of the old school way of wrestling. A lot of these stipulations. So I'll throw it back to the host here, but I just wanted to say you bringing up the older ways of getting tapes or having to rent them or trade the videos. Pardon. It made me think back to listen. I didn't have the luxury either back then, so it's really cool that you brought that point up.
And I will say this: it is great that everybody has YouTube and the WWE Network or Peacock or whatever you want to call it to see all this stuff. But man, young people missed out on the thrill of going to Blockbuster or the movie gallery or whatever your local video store was called. And you go in there and crossing your fingers and be like, what is going to be there this week? What are they going to have? And finding these old, the Jim Crockett Senior Memorial Cup, or the best of the WWF, these big clamshells, which I got a whole rack of them over there across the room from me right now. It was such a thrill to go in there, and my mom, the grocery store was right next door to the video store, and so my mom would go in there about groceries, and I would go up there and pace around the video store for half an hour, 40 minutes, and I'd pick me out a wrestling video or two and a Nintendo game a lot of times for the weekend, and so you didn't want to burn yourself. You had to make smart choices in both categories, whether it's the wrestling tape or the video game, and I think there's some these people that never get that opportunity. They're missing out on something, man. There was a big thrill there in that game of chance you were playing on what was going to be there, and were you going to make a good choice? Because you're stuck with that choice all weekend, Tyler. You go and pick two out, and they're not that good. Well, that's just what we got. We can't just hit the back button and click on the next one, and hit the back button and click on the next one. We chose poorly, and now we've got to sit and watch it because that's what we got to watch.
No, you're correct. There was no advance in technology nowadays. There was no type of streaming that was streaming back then. You had to either let it play or hit pause on the old VCR if you wanted to see a replay or to any of that effect. It's amazing to me, Gene, that the 90s now seem like the 60s or 50s, and we're just in 2024. But it's been enough time removed, but I'm with you. I used to struggle. Do I watch WrestleMania or this other WWE event, or do I go like what you were bringing up with the Jim Crockett Memorial Cup or some NWA? Because I was torn, because I had to choose wisely due to what was on the cover, and sometimes that may be disappointing. You may think,
Yep.
"Oh, I'm going to get some great matches," and it's just like when you watch any kind of movie. I was a little disappointed and let down. So I love having a conversation about how things used to be, and I don't mean to sound like I'm revisiting history, but I mean we are.
We
I
are.
mean in all facets here. Yeah.
That's what these podcasts exist for. Honestly, it's it's nostalgia, man. That's what most people are here for, more so than to hear the results. It's just to relive this stuff, or for young people who didn't get to live it to kind of get an idea of what it was like. But I'll try to quit digressing so much, or this is going to be a 4-hour podcast about a 90-minute, 2-hour show, whatever it was. But so we saw the rolling of the dice. Then we go to White Lightning and Tim Horner's back here in front of the wood paneling, and he's telling us about his upcoming match with the Night Stalker. When do you first remember seeing the Night Stalker in action, and what gimmick was he portraying at the time? I can guess which one it was, probably, but
It was. I think it was back when he was Adam Bomb in the WWE, and then I saw him with Brian Adams and Chronic, which
right.
was very fascinating. But the Night Stalker, I love this persona. It's like Brian Lee. I think I prefer this presentation of Brian Clark. The Night Stalker, the music, everything just seemed to fit him. I mean, here's this big giant monster that he's athletic, he can do scientific moves, but he's got an excellent side slam. And I'm kind of getting ahead, but I I loved everything about his character. I'm thinking, why wasn't this guy more successful in a lot of the bigger promotions? Sure, he found enough success, But you could tell with Smoky Mountain Wrestling and some of these smaller promotions, no wonder he was pushed to the moon. He had the look. He kind of reminds you, not as far as looking like Sid, but kind of that big monster that was athletic. But to be fair to Sid, I think he could do more than
Oh,
than
yeah.
Sid. I mean, so it's not really fair to categorize or put those two together on everything, because the guy could do a drop kick. He was doing a lot of lightweight stuff for a guy that big, and cut too. I mean, he had the bodybuilder physique, but there was so many more dynamics to his wrestling style. So absolutely enjoyed the Night Stalker.
Yeah, I liked this gimmick, the name and the look a lot better. Like, I wish he could have used this going forward. Atom Bomb was just such a punny, silly name, and the goggles and the 3 Mile Island is his hometown and all that silliness. But, of course, by then, this is early Brian Clark here, so he's still finding his way. And, by the time he becomes Atom Bomb, he's really getting much more impressive, like, with the aerial maneuvers he could do for a guy his size. He could move. Like I said, he could do a lot more than Sid. I remember the first time I remember reading about him in the magazines in Smoky Mountain, but the first time, seeing him like in WCW on a random Starcade, he wrestled Sid. And in my 13-year-old mind at the time, I was like, this is going to be amazing. And of course, it was a turd, because you put those big guys against each other. It's always great in theory, but then in practice, it's like they're doing bear hugs on each other. Like, it was terrible. It was a terrible match. But here he is against White Lightning, Tim Horner. I had no idea when I was younger, until in more recent years, listening to Cornette malign the good name of Tim Horner, how disliked he was in some circles. And some of the stories that Jim tells about him from this era don't paint him in the greatest light. But they had a pretty good little match here, and it went about 13 minutes. So we opened up with a minute and a half of the Mongolian Stomper. These guys put in some time. They go about 13. What'd you think of that ending there, the disqualification finish?
It was all right. I thought it was kind of a easy way out, but I didn't hate it. I get that it was the old NWA rule or old wrestling rule that if you went over the top rope. So for that alone, I respect it. I just thought, man, you're giving them so much time. I know they'll probably continue possibly a series of matches, but I was a little let down, if I'm honest, by the outcome. I just felt like they had built up this match so much. Why not give us a clean finish? And I realize not every finish needs to conclude this way, but why not here? That's just coming from me.
For me, my only theory from a booking standpoint is you're about to have these two right back out here in the corners of Brian Lee and Kevin Sullivan, and you didn't really want to tip your hand either way as far as Night Stalker beats Horner or Horner pins Night Stalker. Is that foreshadowing something that's about to happen in the Spike match? But if we have a DQ, nothing's really resolved. So nothing's resolved between them. So now there's a little extra tension with them out here at ringside. That's the only reasoning I really can think. It's definitely a cop-out finish, but I kind of get it based on where we're headed. If they were done for the night, then yeah, Night Stalker needs to probably just beat Tim Horner, based on some of the other stuff we've got happening coming up. But I get it. And like you said, in those days, you could use the DQs and different things like that to kind of tell a story and move things along. And it kind of meant more when you had your DQs and your countouts and your time limit draws. Now, for anybody that follows my USWA podcast, Memphis started leaning on that way too heavy in '93, and we're having 7-match cards with 5 DQs that are just maddening. You've got a unsanctioned steel cage match between Randy Savage and Jerry Lawler that ends in a DQ, and it's just like, what are we doing? Like, that's crazy. But in this instance, I can live with it. I don't love it, but I can live with it.
No, it's fair, and the way you explained it, I tended to overlook that they would be right back out. So from that standpoint, I've got a better understanding. But I got to be honest, I didn't enjoy it, the result. But Hey, it was a fun match. Tim Horner had a lot of energy. I mean, they explained the story on commentary with Tim Horner evading the bigger non-stalker. I mean, that made sense. It was psychology for him to use his quickness, and he wasn't a small man, but anybody looked small compared to Brian Clark, the non-stalker. And if you research Tim Horner, and I had to come with a little bit of research. I'm not the historian Mr. Jackson is, out of respect. That's how much I admire the guy that hosts these programs. But from 1984 to 1988, Tim Horner was in a tag team called White Lightning with, speaking of one of the Armstrongs, I believe it was Brian, and they were in NWA Jim Crockett Promotions, and they actually, I believe it was Horner and Armstrong in the UWF Mid-South, and they took the tag belts away from Sting and Rick Steiner. So it was kind of fascinating to kind of learn some facts and a little bit more about Horner's history. Because to be honest, until Smoky Mountain Wrestling, why I bring this up, Gene, I didn't know about a lot of the wrestlers till then, to watching
Mhm.
these type shows, because I got caught up in some of the main event guys like a lot of us do, and you forget about a lot of the great mid card and underneath card guys that Cornette was using at the time, and I did not realize the animosity that Horner and Cornette had and
Yeah, I
stuff,
didn't
and
either.
how certain people did not like him, and I believe he was a county commissioner in East Tennessee at one point. I may be
Yeah.
mistaken, but
No, he was. And I assumed when I first learned early on that Cornette had wanted to get Brad in there, I assumed that, okay, well, he ends up with Horner because he couldn't get Brad, so he got Brad's longtime tag team partner as a consolation prize. But then the more I dig into it and learn, no, Tim was actually involved in the early getting Smoky Mountain off the ground. Like he helped. He had ends with a lot of the buildings, and he kind of helped Cornette. He didn't fund it. He had a guy. He had a money mark, as they call him, that was wanting to put some money into a show, and he was willing to kind of hand that off to Cornette. But Cornette already had Rick Rubin, bankrolling this thing, and I think that's kind of where him and Horner got sideways right out of the gate. Was Horner had expectations because he found a guy with $10,000 to throw towards some shows and got him a couple buildings. He thought he was going to be the champ. And when he wasn't, he's out here wrestling, in the second, third match. I think there was some bad feelings. And of course, if you want to know all the ins and outs of the bad feelings between Horner and Cornette, you can go check out Jim Cornette's podcast. What I want to know, Tyler, would you have been at the concession stand to get one of these styrofoam lightning bolts that Tim was bringing out to the ring, throwing out to the crowd, much like at this time Bret Hart's putting sunglasses on kids in the front row? Tim Horner's tossing styrofoam lightning bolts out to fans as the match is starting.
You know what, Gene? I think I would, because at the time, just being a kid, I would have
Yeah.
thought that was awesome. And hey, major props to Tim Horner for coming out to Garth Brooks' "The Thunder Rolls." I love the song, so it fits. I mean, he's White Lightning, Tim Horner. Why not just play some Garth Brooks while you're at it?
Did you ever hear Tim Horner's rendition of "Shameless" that aired on Smoky Mountain TV?
No, I did not. I'll have to go
Oh,
look it up.
look that up, and that's a fun look that up, and then look up Jim Cornette's podcast where he talks about it, and he gets a call from his financier Rick Rubin going, "Why in the hell is Tim Horner singing on my television show?"
Maybe that's where the heat between everybody started. It was "Shameless"
Exactly.
by Garth
Didn't
Brooks.
help, but yeah. So good little match. 13 minutes they put in, the most time so far.
Hey guys, this is Wolfie D from PG-13. Check out my podcast, Live and in Color with Wolfie D, every Monday at noon. We're talking Memphis, we're talking ECW, WCW, WWF, everywhere that I've been. We even have some great guests, some Hall of Famers on the show with us. Every Monday at noon, Live and in Color with Wolfie D.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Give Me Back My Pro Wrestling, the podcast that's based on the old school, but can still help you find the good stuff from today. Jimmy Street and the Plastic Sheik, Jared, are the undisputed tag team champions of the wrestling podcast world. From thought-provoking topics to superstar interviews to action figure expertise. This team does it all. And all they ask is, give me back my pro wrestling! Every other Thursday, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Moving on, they're going to be back out here in the corners for our next match. But before we get to that, we hear from Kevin Sullivan, who in this interview tells us he's not crazy, but that screenshot would certainly tell a different story, Tyler.
Yeah, he looks like a madman. Kevin Sullivan could just embody so much of the bizarre. Like Les Thatcher, I'm kind of just borrowing from a lot of the two great announcers we had. Not just a lot, we had two terrific commentators. And Kevin Sullivan, if you look up madman or a crazy person as far as wrestling in the dictionary, you'd have to have Kevin Sullivan listed right beside of it. And what about the interview, Gene, where he acts like he went to Norway to club some seals or something? Maybe it was sea lions. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah.
It was such an oddball interview, but I was so captivated. It didn't have to make sense. Kevin Sullivan will normally bring the point home, but even on his wackier promos, I find myself entertained. I'll either laugh or I'll be scared. He'll bring some different emotions, most certainly, and that's why he's one of the best. I mean, rest in peace to Kevin Sullivan, who sadly we lost, and I had the immense honor. I know people are so sick of this story, but I'm going to tell it anyways, where I got to learn some commentary by sitting beside the Taskmaster.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, sure
I'm
did.
jealous of that, man. That's very cool, man.
Well, I was very fortunate, Gene. Got to do some independent work, and I'm by no means trying to say I'm a experienced broadcaster, but I was trying to sit under the learning tree of Kevin Sullivan, and he was a class act, and I'll never forget it. And it's a shame we wait till these wrestlers pass or anybody we look up to, and you take it for granted. But I got emotional because I didn't know him personally, but you found a connection with him just as a fan, and especially getting to meet him that one. Well, it was actually an afternoon. I was going to say not, and just listen to him relay stories about Gordon Soley, Paul Orndorff, his days in Georgia, and all the territories, Mid-Atlantic, to bring up all these names that we're familiar with and some were not, that he just knew was just incredible. So I'll never forget that experience. So I have to bring it up anytime we see Kevin Sullivan. I can't help but reminisce. I mean, that was the one fortunate moment and opportunity I had, just to be able to absorb knowledge and information from one of the greats in Kevin Sullivan. So very sad he's passed away. Just he was a great guy.
Oh yeah, and folks, if one of my favorite interviews with Kevin Sullivan, if you'll go on YouTube and put in "Back to the Territories" with Kevin Sullivan, there's a sit-down interview with Cornette and Sullivan where they talk about the Florida territory, which is just really, really interesting. Just a real captivating interview, and it gives you some real insight into Kevin Sullivan's early career and the Florida territory in general, and the great Eddie Graham and the influence that he had over Sullivan, and where Sullivan learned booking, and of course where Dusty Rhodes' booking was influenced, and just a really interesting interview. So if you're a wrestling history nerd like me and Tyler, check that one out. I can't recommend it enough.
I would recommend it as well. I've only seen parts of it, Gene, but I'm so glad you brought it to everyone's attention, including mine, because I have actually seen just snippets of it. Anytime you get Jim Cornette and Kevin Sullivan together talking territorial history, it's going to be phenomenal. And you're so right. It was fantastic from what I was able to watch and hear.
Yeah, it's great. Like I used to buy those interviews back in the day, and now Kayfabe Commentaries is uploading, 1 or 2 a month of those full interviews are starting to pop up now on their YouTube channel. So I like to check it, once every other week or so and see what's new. And when that one popped up, I'm sure it wasn't coincidental. They put it up right after he passed, and I had seen it years ago, but I watched it again just recently, and sat and watched every minute of it all over again, even though I had seen it a few years ago, and it was just as interesting to me the second time as it was the first time. So good stuff.
Oh, you can't help but be compelled by both those guys talking some wrestling history. I mean, it was truly a gem, and it just makes you. I'll reiterate, be thankful for the memories and getting to observe a master. I mean, it was true with his gimmick, true in real life. It was life imitating art in a lot of ways. I think it would be safe to assume.
Absolutely. So that brings us to the Singapore Spike match. If you're watching this on YouTube, if you're not just listening on Apple or Spotify, wherever you're taking this in, we appreciate you. But if you are watching this on YouTube, or if you're not, you can go find it on YouTube. Here is what we were describing earlier. There's the boxes, yellow box. I like the color. Like, they're not just plain old wooden boxes. They painted them yellow to go along with the yellow and red color scheme of the ring. And folks, in one of those boxes is the golden spike that Kevin Sullivan had been known to stab people with over the years, and we don't know which one it's in. Therein lies the drama of this match. So tell us a little bit about it, Tyler.
Yeah, there's the mystery. To me, this was kind of similar to a bull rope match. I mean, I know there was some variables between the two, but you had where there was boxes on each turnbuckle. I guess is where I drew the similarities. And I'll tell you, this match was going to be crazy because you had Kevin Sullivan. You had all these weapons introduced: a steel chair, a ring bell, a hammer, wire cutters at one point. So it was just unreal. And Brian Lee, I thought it was great, man. It built a lot of anticipation. And like you said, drama. The fans were definitely into it because of Brian Lee and Kevin Sullivan, to both their credits. And the psychology was just always going to be unique, but it still made sense. And I like how you brought up about the color. It stood out. That was a brilliant point. And I like Night Stalker and Horner being involved because they were teammates of each of these gentlemen. And it was very different seeing how they were handcuffed to each other. At one point, Sullivan positions Brian Lee over to where the Night Stalker Brian Clark could hit him to gain an
Yeah.
advantage. So it made sense. I mean, I know it seems a little odd, but the whole match was going to be bizarre anyways. And I found that pretty interesting. I mean, that's probably pretty easy to say, but I can't help it. I'll just go back to it. To me, it interests me at least.
Well, I've unfortunately gotten kind of cynical watching recent 1993 USWA because, as I described, there's been a lot of interference. The TV matches, like every match, is ending in DQ run-ins and things like that. So, if these guys hadn't have been handcuffed at ringside, my first thought would be like, all right, Night Stalker's probably going to run in and interfere. But no, he's handcuffed to the turnbuckle. Yes, he managed to choke Brian and get a couple of licks in on him, but we knew some kind of conclusive finish was going to have to happen here because you had these other two guys handcuffed. So it kind of told us that, hey, something conclusive's got to happen, right?
Oh, it's got to. There's got to be some climatic finish to the match, but you also got to have that beginning and middle to make the ending intriguing. And the same can be said for wrestling. The match here with the Singapore Spike match, I love the mystery that's revolved around this match because, like you brought up, Gene, there you don't know where the spike's going to be. Which box is it? It's a guessing game, and eventually we see, is it the Night Stalker? I'm trying to recall if he's the one that discovers the spike, and he ends up giving it to Kevin Sullivan, but it ends up costing the
Right.
Taskmaster at the end. I know he's called the Master, but I still call him the Taskmaster. So
That's completely forgivable. He's the Taskmaster to me too. I prefer that over the Games Master of the Varsity Club days. But yeah, you're right. The Night Stalker gives him the spike, but things go awry, and you're expecting, this thing once this spike comes out, this is going to turn into a massacre. Somebody's going to be, Brian Lee's probably going to be bleeding like he's been shot, or if he's getting his revenge tonight, Kevin Sullivan's probably going to be bleeding like he's going to be shot, and somebody's going to die, and then they're going to pin him. But no, it's a schoolboy roll up, Tyler. Surprise, surprise.
No, it was shocking. Yeah, I'm with you. I thought somebody was going to be needing a lot of stitches. We were going to see blood, and it was totally the opposite, which I didn't mind, but it was very opposite from a lot of the Spike theme matches that
Yeah,
we've
it was
seen in wrestling,
un-Kevin Sullivan
especially.
like.
Exactly.
Now,
I mean, yeah, go ahead. I jumped in. See what I'm doing?
no,
I'm jumping
go
ahead.
ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead and finish your thought on the finish, and then we'll get into the post-match shenanigans here.
No, the only thing I was going to add, Gene, is it made more sense to have the Night Stalker, and you brought it up. I mean, not only you did bring this point home that's why having Horner and the Night Stalker out there was important, and that's why I have to be patient with watching these things, because it could be the next match, 2 matches ahead, and I just like anytime you make a fan think, and that it's not always easy to say, "Oh, this is going to happen. So and so is going to go over it." I think that's important, and it's a missing formula in wrestling sometimes, not all the time. And we got a perfect example of that in this match. That's the only thing I was going to finish with.
And that's a good point. I mean, that's one thing Cornette was good at, was storytelling. You had basically 2 matches on this card back to back they're telling part of the same story. And knowing Kevin Sullivan like we do, he's not going to be happy that the Night Stalker has screwed up and cost him this match, in his mind at least. And as we pointed out, the Night Stalker is handcuffed to the rope, and for some reason, the key doesn't seem to be working, and they cannot get the Night Stalker uncuffed from the turnbuckle. This clearly was not part of the the plan, as Kevin's pushing him and Night Stalker's wanting to react, but he's also looking down like, am I still handcuffed to this freaking turnbuckle? Yes, I am. And Sullivan's trying to be mad, but at the same time trying to let him get untethered, and he can't. They finally give up on the key, and now the poor guy is having to just start frantically unscrewing the turnbuckle to finally just unhook the turnbuckle to get the Night Stalker loose, so that he can finish up what business we have here. I'm thinking there was supposed to be more to this, but it got so awkward with all this waiting for him to get loose that it didn't really play out probably to the full extent that it would have. But what it leaves us with, even if it's not the most exciting way to get there, we're now heading into Night Stalker as a babyface, no less, against Kevin Sullivan moving forward here in Smoky Mountain.
And I did not see that coming. Night Stalker being the babyface, but Kevin Sullivan's always ingenious, to Cornette's credit. I mean, he's just a master strategist as far as storytelling, and I felt so sorry for Brian Clark. I mean, when things go wrong, that's very hard to always disguise. So I thought they did a stellar job, because they just improvise. I mean, sometimes you just got to do what you can in that situation. So I thought it was still a pretty fun finish. It did not go according to plan, but they're both pros, and they made it work.
Yeah, and if you're not some, guy like me that's looking for that aspect of it, you're not necessarily going to pick up on it. But to me, the reason it really stood out is poor Brian Clark is very new to the business here. So I'm sure he was freaking out, like, oh my, what do I do? I'm supposed to be, we're supposed to be fighting now, and I'm still tethered to the ring over here. And, and that's the great thing about Kevin Sullivan, because he's perceived as such an evil character that, that old saying, he could turn Genghis Khan babyface, like pretty much anybody, if you put him again, even as unlikely as a babyface as the Night Stalker may be, if you put him on the other side of Kevin Sullivan, he's going to be a babyface, because anybody that opposes Kevin Sullivan, the fans are going to support him, because, we've learned that Kevin Sullivan is just the epitome of pure evil. So, all right, this guy's going to fight Kevin Sullivan. All right, we'll cheer for him. We'll give him a chance anyway. So good stuff.
And Yeah, very good stuff. And you definitely don't want to see Kevin Sullivan as a babyface. He's much better as a heel, as that evil,
Right.
vindictive character. So I'm with you. I mean, he he had that uncanny ability to turn anybody, probably the most unlikely of people, and including the Night Stalker. But I'm sure there's other illustrations throughout his historic career where Kevin Sullivan has just done some magic tricks essentially in the storytelling process because he's so creative. He's a booker himself and he picks up on things.
For sure. So the next match that we're going to move into, I'll let you get us going on the match, but it's kind of a lead into it here. So we get a promo from Tracy Smothers, the wild-eyed Southern boy. And Tracy and the Dirty White Boy is a feud that's been brewing here for a while in Smoky Mountain. Of course, Dirty White Boy, Smoky Mountain heavyweight champion. He has turned his back. So the pride of Bucksnort, Tennessee, the Dirty White Boy, Tony Anthony, has taken on a manager who is famously, one of the legends of East Tennessee, Ron Wright. And these guys have turned their back on Tennessee. They have adopted New York City as their home. Tony Anthony is coming out here wearing New York Yankee jerseys and hats. Just tremendous angle here. So Tracy cuts a promo. He's looking for revenge tonight. This thing's been building and building and building. And of course, Ron Wright over the years has been known for a couple of things. He's been known for what he called his chisel, which was a gimmick that he would pull out of his trunks and just massacre people with, much like Kevin Sullivan's golden spike that we just spoke of in the last match. He had what he called his chisel, and from what I hear, he would file that thing down, and it wasn't any trickery with razor blades or nothing. Ron Wright would just bust you open with this chisel if need be. But he was also known for being the master of the Tennessee chain match. So in the build up to this, Ron Wright comes out, bless his heart, he's in a wheelchair now. He comes out, he's got something wrapped up in what appears to be a Piggly Wiggly bag or something. We don't know what it is, but it is revealed to be his Tennessee chain. Look at his Yankee shirt he's got on there.
that entertains me already.
It really does. That's good stuff. And then we cut to promo Dirty White Boy. He's got a chain. He's got his chain around his neck. He's got a freaking pistol. We're out in the woods of New York City, apparently. He got his Yankees hat on, and he's telling us all about how he's going to own Tracy Smothers because this is Ron Wright's match. This is the Tennessee chain match, and he is going to retain the championship right here in good old Pikeville against his nemesis, Tracy Smothers. The last match, I don't know, I think I might have neglected to mention this, but as we've said, so far, Mongolian Stomper went a minute and a half. Tim Horner and Night Stalker went 13 minutes and 12 seconds. Brian Lee and Kevin Sullivan went about 7 minutes and 5 seconds. Now, we're getting ready to put some time in here, Tyler. Tell us a little bit about this Tennessee chain match for the Smoky Mountain heavyweight title.
Well, first off, before we get into the match, I love those stills of Ron Wright. I'll be the first to tell you, I grew up in Kingsport, Tennessee, where he was famous for having those Tennessee chain matches. I know Knoxville as well. Whitey Codwell was one of his famous opponents. Here's a sidebar, and this is really interesting, and I didn't realize this, but talking to my maternal grandfather, he actually knew Whitey Codwell. He wasn't a wrestling fan, is what was so interesting about this, but he knew of Whitey. He knew he was a wrestler, and he remembers Ron Wright too, and them wrestling down at the Kingsport Civic Auditorium. I mean, Cornette, like yourself, I'm sure you guys know all this. But Ron Wright is a decorated wrestler. I mean, you mentioned it in East Tennessee, and I love how the Dirty White Boy, Tony Anthony, they're positioned to be Yankees, New Yorkers, and they turn their back, and they're really just some good old boys from Tennessee because you can tell he's not got a Bronx accent. When he's
Right.
Tony Anthony, I mean, he's out in the woods thinking it's Central Park. That's what they want us to believe, and it's actually probably just out in Morristown or somewhere in East Tennessee near the Smoky Mountains or whatever. But it's fun, it's fun. And but getting to the match, I mean, Tracy Smothers is God rest his soul, another one that I'm thankful we've got this kind of video footage to relive some of the classic encounters. And I would include this with this Tennessee chain match, a lot of history as we've discussed. And I'll tell you what, fans, they become energetic and alive, just like with Brian Lee for Tracy Smothers, the wild-eyed Southern boy. And he's always gave passionate promos, and he wrestles with the same kind of passion. And so does Dirty White Boy Tony Anthony. The way that Smothers was able to bounce Tony Anthony's head like a basketball, I always found those spots to be entertaining because, I mean, it was repetitive, but it made
Yeah.
sense. It wasn't just, oh, let's just bounce his head off the turnbuckle. You could tell it was personal. It was the issues between these two guys, and Smothers choking the Dirty White Boy, and tapping the three corners already. You think, well, he might have a chance to win this early. That's the goal, but they gave it plenty of time. And I think these classic gimmick matches, when they're done properly, Gene, are just thrilling to watch. And this was no different between these two. And you've got two pros like Smothers and Tony Anthony with Ron Wright as his manager was just perfect. And I love how the babyface comes back when he needs to, when it's necessary, and Tony Anthony will cheat as the heel or use the overzealousness of I don't think that's even a word. I try to create one there, so forgive me. But he gets overexcited and stuff, and it's just the visual, the how graphic it was, the way they were choking each other out. Now this time they bled. I mean, it took the Tennessee chain match, not the Singapore spike match
Now,
previously, but this
see,
type of match. Yeah, go ahead,
watching
please.
this, not to interrupt you, but watching this show, like I said, I've seen it, but it's been years. And when the Singapore Spike match happened and there was no blood, I thought they must not be allowed to bleed in this gym. It must be like a no blood thing, either in Kentucky or the gym or something. Because my gosh, Kevin Sullivan surely would have stabbed him in the head with a spike, made him bleed. But little did I know, as you just pointed out, no, we were saving it for the the Tennessee chain match because we saw plenty of this one. And that was probably wise. If you just saw a bunch of blood in the previous match, it would have made this mean a little less. And you really felt for Tracy in this match as he's getting worked over with the Tennessee chain. And like you say, he's kind of at the disadvantage because this is Ron Wright's match. But just to comment on something you said earlier, we kind of pointed out before the match, and I think this is, some of the genius of Jim Cornette's booking. This would have been a battle between two Tennessee boys, Tracy Smothers and Dirty White Boy, who, like I said, has always been billed as Bucksnort, Tennessee, and Ron Wright, who everyone knows is, a legendary Tennessee wrestler, along with his brother Don Wright, not to leave Don out in the cold. So as heels, to have these guys turn their back on Tennessee and the South completely and become, because, we know, being from the South, a lot, especially like back in this era, how some people, especially up in Kentucky, in the mountains of, East Tennessee and Kentucky, how people felt about them Yankees. For two Tennessee boys, homegrown Tennessee boys, to turn their back on the South and claim the North, the New York City, as their hometown and be self-professed Yankees, that's heat, man. That's worse than Barry Darso claiming to be a Russian back during the Cold War. I mean, it's treason. So just really good stuff, man. But sorry, I didn't mean to break into it.
No, I'm glad you did because it's so true and fitting that we're discussing a Tennessee chain match, and you had two guys from Tennessee that would betray the whole South. They were kind of bringing back that Civil War mentality. I mean, you would see people in Appalachia serving the Union Army too, so they would still be divided. But, the rebel flag, Tracy Smothers was talking about his heritage, the wild-eyed Southern boys, also part of a great tag team, I believe, with another Armstrong. So we've got a lot of Armstrong
Right.
ties with Smoky Mountain Wrestling. And Tracy Smothers, he's so underrated as one of the greats. I don't think he gets enough credit at times. And the Dirty White Boy as well. These guys, you could tell they were great at selling. They can endure whatever stipulation and make it worth watching where my attention did not stray. That's why I think I love these kind of programs because I always find where I'm captivated. I'm just involved. into what they're doing, and that's the whole point. And to me, Gene, too, the one spot that stands out is when the Dirty White Boy would tie up Tracy Smothers like you would see cowboys do to calves. I thought that was intelligent. Yet the monkey flip that came out of nowhere, and I think that
Yeah.
was a nice surprise because you were starting to wonder where's the logic. How's the psychology going to work? How is Tracy Smothers going to be able to escape? He's been choked out. He's fired back on the Dirty White Boy. He's had Ron Wright trip him as the Hill manager, and he's trying to overcome these odds. And now he's got his legs tied up, but he musters up enough strength to where he can do this monkey flip and use momentum to flip over the Dirty White Boy. So, I mean, what do you think about that? I have to ask you the question.
Well, that was something I was going to ask you. Over the years, seeing chain matches, leather strap matches, the Indian strap matches with Wahoo McDaniels and different people, and I remember the big Sting Invader strap match from Super Brawl 3. I didn't feel that over the years the announcers especially, did a great job of getting across to the fans the concept of the chain or the strap match, as far as the tagging the corners and the consecutive, going through tagging the corners, what necessitates a reason to start over, what making all that make sense. I thought that from a storytelling perspective, from Tracy and the Dirty White Boy, and from Lance and Les Thatcher, they did a very good job of laying it out early on. Like, hey, whenever someone hits an offensive maneuver that breaks up the momentum of the other person, that starts the count over, and that is when you're back to one. I thought they did a really good job of illustrating that early on, and in some ways, it kind of flew in the face of some of the things they did later, where they were both tagging the turnbuckles. You had to kind of shut your mind off right there and going, why are we doing that? But, I thought they executed that a lot better than I've seen it done. That same year, Sting and Vader would do a similar thing in their strap match, and I thought this was a lot better executed. I had the good fortune of getting to interview Tony Anthony along with Doug Gilbert recently, and I kicked myself. I lay down in bed that night and I thought, oh my gosh, I just interviewed Tony Anthony and I did not talk to him about his Tracy Smothers feud. And to this day, that bugs me. Now, luckily, him and Doug are good friends, and Doug said, we'll talk to him again. And that's going to be at the top of my list of things to discuss, because to me, this was the defining feud of Smoky Mountain in those initial couple of years, was the Dirty White Boy and Tracy Smothers feud, I thought. And then they went on to make they were a great tag team together, the Thugs, and they had a run with Dirty White Boy as the babyface and them as partners, and that was great stuff. But I'm usually not a fan. Like, over the years, traditionally, I'm not a fan of these chain and strap matches where the gimmick is having to drag them and tag the corners, because it's usually so convoluted in the execution of it. And in the finish, they just always try to do some weird finish like that where it comes down to the wire. But I thought, as far as chain matches go, they pulled it off. And oh my gosh, 26 minutes. This was by far twice as long as any other match on the card, including the main event. The crowd went nuts. Like, I really think they should have ended the show with this, and we'll talk about why once we talk about the main event. But this really would have been a high point for people to leave the arena happy with Tracy winning the title and the way it all came down, and people just lost their mind. It was very well done.
Yeah, very well executed. And there's an argument to be made, because these guys were working so hard. The history of a Tennessee chain match and the fact that we're having it in Kentucky was great, because they saw a lot of great chain matches themselves. And what I appreciate about it, Gene, is the history, bringing Ron Wright, knowing the history with Whitey Codwell. Les Thatcher was a tag team champion with Whitey Codwell, doing a little bit of preparation going into this program. And I just found myself fascinated. A lot of these matches, I'll kind of my attention goes somewhere else. But with this match, they were doing all they could. You could tell they were telling a very riveting story. You didn't know who was going to win. I thought that was great. How there's a difference in trying to win the match early and like you were aforementioning, how's the finish going to be, or is it going to be a little hokey? And it wasn't at all. It came out of
Right.
nowhere where it looked like the dirty white boy Tony Anthony was going to get that fourth tap on the turnbuckle for that fourth corner, and all of a sudden Tracy Smothers just outsmarts him, and I don't know if he jumped over him or however he did it, but he ends up tagging that fourth corner to win the match, and this being the Smoky Mountain champion. That was a big moment, very crucial, and I'm so jealous that not only are you talking to Doug Gilbert, Tommy Rich, but Tony Anthony. So I cannot wait till you get him back on Doug Gilbert's podcast, and please ask him about this rivalry because I want to know more. I mean, it just makes me want to
Absolutely.
investigate as a fan. It was a tremendous match, and I'm normally not a fan of a lot of gimmick matches, but the Tennessee chain match worked. I think my fondness for the riots being in East Tennessee, and especially where I grew up in Kingsport, the Tri-Cities, and Whitey Codwell, and starting to understand the wrestling history there, makes me love this match even more and respect what Ron Wright and his brother Don and all the others were able to do for wrestling, not just in East Tennessee, but I think across the board.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And if you're listening to this and you hear that name Whitey Caldwell and that doesn't mean anything to you, do a Google search, read up on him. That guy was a huge, huge star in his day, and of course, Ron Wright was his big rival. And man, when he died, he died in a car accident, I believe it was. The world stopped in East Tennessee for a day, and people, like you said, it's like you're talking about your grandfather, people who weren't even wrestling fans and knew who he was and respected the guy and knew what he meant to the area. So read up on him, learn a little bit about the history of wrestling over there, because he's a huge, huge part of it. And, Cornette talked about how at one of the Night of Legend shows, they brought Whitey Caldwell's family there and, did a tribute to him and said that, all those years later, 20 something years, 30 years, whatever it was after, he had died, you had a whole arena full of people on their feet, chanting his name and everything. And that's cool because people, don't necessarily always remember history and, people kind of get lost to time. So the fact that, he made that much of an impression that people's kids and grandkids still respected the guy and thought a lot of him is pretty awesome.
I agree with everything you just said, Gene. And listen, I grew up in the area, but I'll be the first to tell you, since it was the older generation, I wish I would have studied up more on the riots and Whitey Codwell. But thanks to my grandfather and people in the area that knew him, and people like yourself that didn't have to grow up in a specific area. I mean, people knew them because they were such big main eventers and headliners for their day and era. And it's nice to hear how Cornette preserves the history and honors those that paved the way. I think that's what everybody should do. And Jim Cornette realized it. And speaking of his podcast, I mean, if you want to know the history of East Tennessee wrestling, he talks about Whitey Codwell and Ron Wright. And we see Tracy Smothers. I know I went lengthy, so forgive me if I went a little long as you were pulling up the seal for the Wild Out Southern boy.
Yeah, it just got it got hung up there for some reason. It popped up and then it went away and it came back. But yeah, there's a shot of Tracy in the dressing room. He's got the Smoky Mountain title. He's bloody with Lance back there. So that was a big deal. He it seemed at one time that no one was going to end the reign of the Dirty White Boy Tony Anthony, and Tracy pulled it off in Ron Wright's specialty match, the chain match. Like you said, that gave it a whole nother element and deeper meaning.
We'll return after these messages.
Hey, it's Bob Smith, and guess what? The Outdated Wrestling Hour is now part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. But hey, no fear, you're still going to hear the unique guests, comedy, music, authors, journalists, funny people. Who knows who's going to end up on the Outdated Wrestling Hour? Remember, it's all new and all old. So check it out. from the WrestleCopia Podcast Network and wherever you get your podcasts. Listen if you know what's good for you.
Hey everybody, Gene Jackson here, inviting you to check out the Retro Wrestling Review, where each week I'm joined by some great co-hosts who help me review classic episodes of USWA Championship Wrestling, and right now we are doing week-by-week reviews of 1993. But we don't just do reviews, sometimes we get a chance to interview some of the people who were there and lived it, plus do watch-alongs. It's a lot of fun, so check out new episodes that drop every Wednesday at WrestleCopia.com. And to find links to everything associated to the podcast, you can go to USWApodcast.com. We've got an interesting main event here, Tyler. I'm gonna let you attempt to make sense of this and kind of explain what we're going to be looking at here in a minute, and we'll get into it.
I'm already starting to wonder how I'm going to describe all this madness, talk about chaos. But next up, we got a main event that is a street fight that's got 9 men in it. I mean, so right away, we've got kind of a unique number. And we've got the stud stable, which I love, by the way. You've got Jimmy Golden with Robert Fuller with Dutch Mantel. He's got the bull rope. There's Brian Matthews interviewing them, and I love how they're working out. You see Fuller with the dumbbells, Jimmy Golden. He doesn't have the beard yet. He's got the old school mustache like he used to have back when he started wrestling. And think about the significance. I know Gene knows this. So many wrestling fans that really study this thing will understand the importance of the Fuller Welsh family to not only Tennessee wrestling, but across the board. And I think these promos are so entertaining. Dutch Mantel wanting to go after Cornette. And we see Arn Anderson. That the pairings were so odd, though, too, but it actually worked. It was fun to see Arn Anderson with the Rock and Roll Express, Ricky Morton, Robert Gibson. You're seeing with Brian Matthews was a busy guy, as you can tell with these interviews. And Arn Anderson, the promo, I love Arn's promos, but this one was a little weird. I'm trying to I don't know that connected. Something about it. If you don't have your underwear, I was trying to. Forgive me for laughing because I love Arn Anderson, but this was odd.
I'm glad it wasn't just me, because that was my takeaway too. I'm like, that is the oddest. I've seen 1,000 Arn Anderson promos in my lifetime, but that was the oddest one. And you can even. It's funny because it was kind of written on Ricky Morton's face. So like even Morton's face was like, what is Arn talking about right now? Like, what are we doing? And for me, growing up in the 80s on Jim Crockett Promotions, seeing Arn Anderson standing there with the Rock and Roll Express just felt blasphemous to start with. It was very odd. But
it makes sense.
It happened. But yeah, so the stud stable, big time heels there. I love Dutch. Jimmy Golden's a great wrestler. Robert Fuller is just one of the most entertaining people in the world. You could put Robert Fuller out in the ring, put him in his Colonel Parker get up, and put him out on Dynamite, Raw, whatever wrestling show you want this week, and he would be entertaining. He's just he can't help but be entertaining. Love that guy. I've gotten a chance to talk to him a few different times over the years, and it's always been a pleasure. I got a chance years ago when I had my old podcast on called Cheap Heat Radio on Blog Talk Radio. I got an opportunity to interview Dutch, and that was some of his favorite interviews I've ever got to do, because he's such a great storyteller, man. He really is. And so I'm hoping I get a chance to interview Robert again sometime through Doug or something, because he's just a super entertaining guy. But so the stud stable, they're pure heels, but somehow they've gotten crossed with the Heavenly Bodies. And so if you're wondering, if you're like, I don't remember Arn Anderson and Bobby Eaton being out of WCW long enough to be in Smoky Mountain. Well, they were on a hiatus, and there had been this working agreement. Jim Cornette had entered into a bit of a working agreement with Bill Watts as he was running WCW for a time, that allowed Arn and Bobby to come to Smoky Mountain. Some of you may or may not remember that the Rock and Roll Express and the Heavenly Bodies showed up on WCW did an angle on a Saturday night show, which led to a match between the Heavenly Bodies and the Rock and Roll Express for the Smoky Mountain Tag Team titles on WCW Super Brawl 3. I referenced Super Brawl 3 earlier with that strap match. Well, and this wasn't a thing that happened those days. To see a Smoky Mountain Tag Team title match on WCW Super Brawl was really surreal, even in '93. And so Arn has come in as a babyface. He showed up under a sheet on Smoky Mountain TV. Cornette always said anybody that comes out of a box is over, but they brought Arn in under a sheet, like a ghost or something. But anyway, they have managed to, as you described, in 1993, a triangle match in general is still kind of a new concept. A 6-man tag team triangle match is an even weirder concept. And like you say, we've managed to establish heat between the Rock and Roll and Arn with both the Heavenly Bodies, which, again, Heavenly Bodies on this night has included Bobby Eaton, which is fun because now we've got Bobby and Stan, the Midnight Express. We've got Tom Pritchard and Stan, the Heavenly Bodies, and you got them all three together with Cornette. Then you've got the Stud Stable, and so just everybody just hates everybody. It's fun. It's fun, and we're going to be in a triangle 6-man street fight. So we are gimmicked to the gills here, Tyler. We've had a Singapore spike match, we've had a chain match, and then for the grand finale, we're going to have a triangle tag team street fight.
Oh, we are. I mean, a lot of fun, but a lot of weirdness, for sure, G.
Yeah, so kind of lead us into that and tell me your thoughts on this. I don't want to. I'll get to mine, but I want to hear yours first before I don't want to muddy the waters with telling you what I think before you tell us what you think. But here's some pictures in the background as you kind of describe what we got here.
No, you're fine, is all I was going to say. This match was entertaining. Bobby Eaton and Stan Lane, great to see him involved with Dr. Tom Pritchard and Jim Cornette. One of the things I noticed right away, I love how Cornette would introduce them, similar to how he did the Midnight Express. It wasn't the ring announcer. Jim Cornette would say it, then it would be Stan Lane to introduce Cornette. It was funny how Cornette was trying to escape Arn Anderson. Like you said, there was a lot of tie-ins and connections with not only Dutch going after Cornette, but Arn Anderson. You had the Heavenly Bodies, just a lot of just chaos, but it was fun chaos. One of the moments that stands out for me, because it was hard to keep up with all of it, as they were mentioning on commentary, was the bull rope that Dutch Mantell had. He made Dr. Tom ride it, which probably is not the best way to say it on a wrestling podcast. But I mean, I don't know how else to say it because he was. And then yeah, exactly. And to see Bobby Eaton, and I'm laughing. God rest his soul. I love beautiful Bobby, but to see him wear a tire, I'm not kidding, was quite the visual. And then Arn Anderson had flour or some kind of powder involved. I know I'm probably skipping ahead. There were just so many fun spots. I mean, there was action on the outside, inside the ring. You had the Stud Stable targeting the Rock and Roll Express or vice versa, whoever had the problems. Or I mean, they were brawling all over the place. It's almost hard to dissect a certain spot. There were a lot of the wackier spots stand out to me. And it's unfortunate. We got some great legends, but this was just kind of a wild Saturday night brawl like at a bar or something. I mean, these guys were just pulling out weapons. They didn't care. Gene, what's your thoughts on the Robert Gibson, Bobby Eaton fighting on the support beams of the basketball goal? That was crazy.
Goodness
I've never
gracious.
seen anything like it. Yeah.
It's so if you followed Smoky Mountain at the time and you knew what led to all this, then you kind of see how we got here, and it's fine. It's understandable. If you're just coming back in a time machine, kind of like we are, and if you hadn't seen any of this and with no context, you just, if somebody hears this podcast and says, hey, I'm going to, before I listen to the podcast, I'm going to watch the show and then I'll listen to the podcast. And so they just watch this show arbitrarily without any context. And they're kind of familiar with Cornette and his views over the years and his criticism of places like ECW and eventually even like AEW and stuff, you'd be like, well, my God, Cornette trashes ECW because it was gimmick matches and it was, wild brawls and it was weapons. And look at that main event, my gosh. And, all by itself, if you just look at this show in and of itself, you think, yeah, this is very non-Jim Cornette booking here. But his point, I think, has always been not necessarily you can't do gimmick matches or you can't do brawls or you can't use weapons, but you got to have a reason. You got to build towards it. It's got to mean something. And these guys, he established over months the rivalry between the Bodies and the Rock and Roll Express, and then the Rock and Roll Express and the Stud Stable, and then the Stud Stable and the Heavenly Bodies. And of course, Bobby just automatically fits in. Arn was kind of the square peg in the round hole of this match, but he had history with the Rock and Roll. He had history with the Midnight Express. It made sense on that level. But I don't necessarily love this match just in and of itself. Again, if you take the backstory of it, it makes sense how we got here. It makes sense we're having a street fight, but if I'm just wanting to sit down and watch, I would have much rather have seen a tag team match between any combination of these tag teams. Would have been more entertaining to me than the brawl. But then again, when are you going to see a tire involved in a Bobby Eaton match and Robert and Bobby Eaton fighting on a basketball goal and fire extinguishers and powder and all this craziness? So it serves its purpose. But to me, sitting down watching this show the other night in one sitting, we go from Singapore Spike to a 26-minute chain match straight into this. I feel like we needed something to kind of break that up, and not to spoil it because you hadn't got there and you've been kind of leading these things. But so it was elimination. So the Rock and Roll, they end up eliminating the Stud Stable and Dutch Mantel. And then the Heavenly Bodies eliminate the Rock and Roll and the Arn Anderson. And so after we had this really great feel-good moment where Tracy overcomes and wins the Tennessee chain match for the title, we end the show on the heels going over in this big, wild melee. And Cornette has even said over the years that if there's booking decisions that he could go back in time and change, that he regrets, one of them is ending Bluegrass Brawl 93 with the heels going over in the main event. That if he had it to do over, he would have went ahead and just put the Rock and Roll over, or he would switch up the lineup and put Tracy and Dirty White Boy on last. But he said he did it at the time because of where they were headed next. They weren't blowing off the feud with the Bodies and the Rock and Roll. Even though Arn was headed back to WCW, Bobby was on his way out as well. Arn literally wrestled on this Smoky Mountain show on February 4th, and he was on a WCW card on February 5th. He flew out of here and was on a WCW show literally the next night. But he said he felt to keep heat on that feud that they needed to win because they were going to show highlights of this on television and have the VHS and all that. But he said in retrospect, as far as the house crowd and it ending flat, where they had been so elated when Tracy won the belt, and then it's like you kind of ended on these guys won. All right, let's go. And I get that, right. It makes sense, but you had two big baby, Brian Lee beat Kevin Sullivan. So, and really, if you look up and down the card, the only heels that won on this entire show was the Heavenly Bodies at the end of the night. So I get it. But again, if it was me, I would have rather seen Tracy win the title to end the show. But then again, could you really have done all this shenanigans that happened in this match and then calm it back down to how the chain match would have, how it had to start out in the beginning to build to the bloody crescendo? So, it's easy to go back and second guess things, in 2024 of how we would have done it better.
No, it is. No, it's hard not to agree with you, Gene. And It's all fascinating. I appreciate your research and how much your studies are brought into your podcasts, and it's a lot of fun because if I miss something, I know I can rely on the host because he's going to cover me. Speaking of tag team wrestling, I may need to make the tag to Gene, so I appreciate his immense abilities as a host and just a podcaster and an interviewer. The guy's terrific, and I can't say enough good things about Gene Jackson and all his podcasts. And man, I'm honored. This show was a lot of fun, but I'm in agreement that Tracy Smothers and the Dirty White Boy would have made a better main event, but you also are able to bring a other perspective into it. Well, if you've got this wild and crazy main event, how could you top it if you were switching out matches? So
Yeah.
that's the thing. I love how it makes you think. It's easy to have hindsight, but you have to kind of put yourself in that booker's role. I'm not trying to say I'm a booker, but to understand the psychology, the methods that go into creating these events.
And Cornette, has pointed out he's been famous over the years for a saying, you don't want to follow a shooting with a stabbing, as in the show has to build on itself. Where and he said that in criticism of shows where you open the show with some wild gimmick match and then you lead into like just a regular old singular tag match, and then it's up and down through the whole card. It's like, you gotta build up the ante as you go up the card. And using that logic, I see why this 6-man triangle, 6-man street fight has to really go on last by those standards. But at the same time, you can't really use today's standards because last week's WWE show opened with a Hell in the Cell match between CM Punk and Drew McIntyre that's been building for months. In my mind, I haven't watched the show yet because I don't keep up with it anymore, but that's the only match on that show I want to go back and watch. And I'm happy that it's on first because now I ain't got to fast forward through 4 hours of other stuff. But in my mind, that's the only match I care about. And you opened with that? Like, where do you go from a Hell in the Cell opener? To a few minutes later, we're going to have some ladies match or something, that's weird to me. So knowing, like I say, Cornette would say that about, some of the matches in the past where especially ECW shows where, you might break 3 tables and go through broken glass and barbed wire and set somebody on fire in the opening match and then have Malenko and Eddie Guerrero in a technical match second. And he would always say, yeah, you can't, follow shooting with a stabbing. And I get that. So I think that's probably where we were at on this. And the fact that he wishes he would have had the baby faces go over in the end just to send everybody home happy. And even he admits that while he had been in the business at this point in 93 for, a little over 10 years, he had just really started. This is the first time that he was booking on his own. He'd been part of committees and different things, but this was the first time that it began and ended with him. And he admitted that, like, hey, it was a bad call. So you got to respect that, when a guy can go back and critique his own stuff, because most people just defend their decisions to the death.
Oh, I definitely have a lot of respect for Cornette admitting and being honest about I could have done this and that better, or hey, I stand by my decision. There's something to be said about that. And man, this was a fun recall to some Smoky Mountain Wrestling, the Bluegrass Brawl in Pikeville, Kentucky. What an experience, just as a wrestling fan, to go back and look at some of the history of the promotion and some of these legends who we forget had passed through, been utilized by Cornette and some of the angles, the storylines that were borrowing from, as Gene mentioned, Memphis and the Fuller's promotion, Southeastern, and back when Goulas was over Tennessee before Jerry Jarrett took over the Memphis part of it, and we would see it in NWA Mid Atlantic. I mean, you could use a lot of examples of where a lot of these chain matches, dog collar matches with Pomper and Valentine, it's just all very extraordinary. And I want to thank you for having me on. This has been fun and very insightful, as I knew it would be. I expected as much, knowing the kind of education Gene Jackson gives you, because I learned that from having him reviewing USWA. And I'm like, this guy just, there's people that know their stuff. And I'm not just saying this to blow smoke. This guy knows his stuff. And I love how if I miss something, hey, he's got my back. Just like I said, just make the tag or listen, I was getting beat up by the bad guys, or however you want to phrase it, and Gene's in there for the big hot comeback. There you go. And I'm going over to the corner. There you go. That's a good way to say it.
Well, man, I appreciate you doing this. It was a lot of fun. I'm sorry if it was too long winded for some folks. We managed to break the 2 hour mark that we hit on yours, so I guess I need to learn to dial it back some. But I hope everybody had as much fun as we did. So for this show for Retro Wrestling, it's been mostly interviews, but I'm going to start rotating out, just straight interviews with review shows like this where I have a guest and we review a particular show, and we're going to mix in some watch alongs where we'll actually watch a show and talk over it. And so I'm hoping you'll come back and do some more, man. We'll pick out have you pick some more show. You hit a home run on this one, so we'll let you pick another one, and we'll do something else, be it Smoky Mountain or who knows what you may pick next time. But I had a blast, and I hope everybody enjoyed watching. I feel like they did. And anytime you want me back on your show, I'm more than happy to do it, because I enjoy talking wrestling with you.
Oh, well, thank you, Gene. And you're more than welcome. The invitation's out there. I'd be more than happy to come back onto this show and review whatever we want to talk about. But I get fortunate, like anybody, that this show was a home run. Now, I may pick another one, and Gene's going, wait a minute, Tyler. This one did not go out of the park. So what are we doing here? So that's going to happen, but I'll be more than happy to oblige Eugene and come back on. And I've definitely got to have you back on Tyler's Takedowns. It was a real joy, and I enjoyed our USWA conversation. I enjoyed listening and watching your podcasts, and this has just been a great fun and learning experience altogether. Let me just put it all together.
Well, like I say, I appreciate you doing it. And before we get out of here, we've mentioned it a few times throughout the show, but tell everybody how they can find Tyler's Takedowns and how they can find all the things that you've got going on if they want to follow you and check out what you're doing.
Sure, you can find Tyler's Takedowns on the DTP Productions feed. It's in association with SJP World Media. You can find recent episodes, past episodes. You can also find some archived episodes of an older show called Back When with a former co-host that's still a good friend of mine called Scottish Danny. He's based in the UK. Actually, the network itself, SJP World Media, is a great network. It's also based in the United Kingdom, and they've got plenty of wrestling, non-wrestling related programming. I've also got a music show that's available on that feed, DTP Productions, called Tyler Talks Music. Like Gene was saying, just because we're wrestling fans, we do have other hobbies, and music being one of those. So I may have to have Gene on the show. I don't know how much you're into music, but I would think you are. So,
Yeah.
hey, we'll probably do some collaborations there. I'll have to have you on that program as well. So I want to get the word out there, both growing new programs, and I'm so thankful that you've allowed me this platform and opportunity to promote them. So that means a lot.
And let me ask you this real quick, because my wife is a huge horror fan. She loves horror movies, and I didn't grow up a horror fan, but being married to her for a little over 10 years now, I've come around to being somewhat of a horror fan, or I've had to watch a lot of it, whether I'm a huge fan or not. But I know you've done some horror related podcast endeavors in the past. Tell us a little bit about that, how it came about, and where they can find some of that.
Well, actually, that was for a website called Geek Buddy. I was doing some writing for a website called Wrestle Buddy. I still do a little bit. I just got back doing more with that great site. A lot of wonderful people there. And so Geek Buddy, it happened 2 years ago. It's amazing, Gene, that 2022 seems like so long ago as we're
Yeah.
speaking now. But it was a horror series that he wanted me to do. I was still learning in podcasting, so I'll look back at it now and go, "Hey, that was not as bad as I thought," but still, you're always looking to improve. And so I shared the one about Michael Myers. I always want to say Mike Myers, not the comedian, but Michael Myers for some reason just rolls off the tongue. And do the remake of Halloween that John Carpenter was a part of. I still have a soft spot for the original Halloween from 1978. So believe it or not, I am into horror movies, but you want to know something very funny? Here's a revelation. If I'm at home by myself, I'm the biggest chicken. I cannot watch them. I have to wait till there's more people. And it's so funny because they play on your psyche. I know
Yeah.
some of it's not real, but it's just enough paranoia that if I go downstairs to get something to drink or a snack or a cup of coffee, it could be daytime. I'm still thinking, hey, the shape's behind me. Michael Myers, you'll probably see in that video podcast from a couple years ago, or there's some kind of creepy doll. I still don't like dolls anyway, so I've watched movies with them. There's a lot of those horror movies though that, for whatever reason, I think our fear uh, makes us gravitate toward them.
Yeah.
It's kind of a weird dynamic. It's hard to explain, but yes, I have experimented with some just quick reviews regarding the horror theme genre, but I actually do like horror movies. Believe it or not, I probably don't seem like I would, but you just never know with people. That's what's
That's
fascinating
right.
about society. Yeah,
Well, you shared that one recently, and it caught my eye because Halloween is my favorite horror franchise of them all. Michael Myers is my favorite, movie horror monster. So that caught you shared that. I was like, whoa, wait a minute, what's Tyler got going on here? So I checked that out, and I wanted to make sure we mentioned it because we're in October. What better time to go back and check out anything Halloween related and horror related? So.
exactly.
Cool stuff, man. Well, once again, thank you very much. It was great talking with you, and we will talk to you again real soon. And thank you all for checking out another episode of Retro Wrestling here on the Retro Wrestling Archive. And if you want to see a lot more old school wrestling like what we've talked about here, check out the channel. We have literally got well over 1,000. We're rocking up over 1,300 old school wrestling videos from the territories from all over the world. If you can't find something to watch on this channel, you're not a wrestling fan. Okay, find a new hobby. So again, for Tyler Peters, I'm Gene Jackson. Thank you so much for checking out this podcast, and share it with a friend that that likes wrestling, or maybe they don't know they like wrestling, but maybe they will if they check this out. Just make sure they got some time on their hands, I suppose. We'll see you next time. Hey, folks, before we get out of here, I'd just like to take a moment to tell you we appreciate you checking out the podcast. And if you would, do us a favor, subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you're listening to this right now, wherever you're watching it. If you'll just take a moment to either subscribe, to rate, and review, let us know what you think. We hope you're liking it, but even if you're not, let us know what you would like to see changed, and we will take that into consideration as we move forward. So we really appreciate any feedback we can get. Also, we just want to say how proud we are to be a part of the WrestleCopia brand of wrestling podcast. Ray Russell brings you something for everyone over at WrestleCopia.com. Check out all the great wrestling podcasts available over there right now. And for all things related to the Retro Wrestling Review Podcast, you can go to USWAPodcast.com, and you can find links to everything we have there: our Facebook, our Twitter /X, our TikTok, our Instagram, our merch store. That's right. We've got shirts, we've got hats, we've got phone cases, we've got all kinds of great stuff. And it's all right there at our store. And you can find a link to it at USWAPodcast.com. There's a link to the YouTube channel we're associated with, the Retro Wrestling Archive. You can find all that there. And if you have questions for us, if you saw something on the show that you have a question about or a comment about, if you've got some info to answer a question we have, or you had a question you want us to read on the air, if you want to work out an ad swap, if you want to have any kind of communication with us, you can go and send an email to USWA@outlook.com, and I will get back to you just as quickly as humanly possible. And if you're a fan of Dangerous Conversations with Doug Gilbert, and if you've heard it, I know you are, check out DougGilbertPodcast.com for all things related to Doug's podcast. You can find links to our Facebook page for the show, our Twitter. You can find links to Doug's social media, his Twitter, his Facebook. All that's available there, plus a link to the YouTube channel. And if you have a question for Doug you would like for me to ask him on the air, you can send that question to DougGilbertPodcast@outlook.com, and we will get it added and it will get answered in a future episode just as quickly as we can work it in. So we appreciate you listening. Thank you so much. And we'll catch you here next week for more.
Hi, this is Mike Needham, host of the Reckless Abandon Podcast with Mike Needham. We invite you to jump on your favorite podcast platform and search for the Reckless Abandon Podcast and give us a listen. I'm sometimes joined by a part-time podcaster, part-time co-host, and full-time wife, Tiffany Nicole. And when you get the wife on the air, sometimes that can lead to some very interesting conversation. We talk wrestling, we talk pop culture, we talk local events in West Tennessee, local happenings in West Tennessee, and a ton of other stuff. I would like to tell you that this is a show about nothing, but Seinfeld already has that copyrighted, so I cannot tell you that our podcast is a show about nothing. But be sure to check out the Reckless Abandon Podcast. Find us on Facebook. Also, look up the Microgroup Podcasting family on Facebook and see some of our other podcasts we have out there. Until next time, make good choices, and always remember, no dollar, no dice.
This is Wrestling Nostalgia, the podcast that dives into wrestling history. Hey, wrestling fans, I'm Dave Dynasty, and if you enjoy podcasts that are knowledgeable and history-driven, then Wrestling Nostalgia is for you. With great guests and fun interviews, there are over 200 episodes in our archives. We chat with several first-time guests and often cover topics not discussed on other podcasts. Look up Wrestling Nostalgia on your favorite podcast platform and visit all of our links at linktree/wrestlepod. That is linktr.ee/RASSLEPOD. And remember, wherever you go, whatever you do, be good, be safe, and keep on growing.